Today, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be sworn in as the President and Vice President of the United States. I think it's safe to say that the months leading up to this day have been uniquely challenging and unlike anything we have seen in the country. We have witnessed increased voter advocacy that resulted in record-breaking voter turnout on both sides. But we have also seen intense levels of civil discourse and events that threaten the very nature of who we are as a democracy, particularly the violent attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. We have today a guest, Peter Swire, who will share some of his perspective on legal and ethical implications of our current political state. He'll talk about technology and free speech, rule of law, and maintaining the civil square. Now, first, let me give you a little bit of an introduction to Peter and his biography. Peter Swire is the Elizabeth and Tommy Holder Chair of Law and Ethics at the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business, where he teaches cybersecurity and privacy. He has appointments by courtesy in the College of Computing and the School of Public Policy. He is Senior Counsel with Alston & Bird, LLP, and Research Director for the Cross-Border Data Forum. Swire graduated from Princeton University with a degree in Economics and Public Policy, studied 1 year in Belgium on a Rotary Foundation Fellowship, and then graduated from the Yale Law School, where he was all but dissertation in political philosophy. Among his government experiences under President Clinton, Swire was Chief Counsel for Privacy, the first person to have U.S. government-wide responsibility for privacy policy. In 2013, in the wake of the Snowden revelations, President Barack Obama named Swire as one of 5 members of the review group on intelligence and communications technology, which made numerous recommendations for reform of U.S. intelligence law, many of which were adopted on a bipartisan basis in the 2015 USA Freedom Act. Also, Swire clerked for the Honorable Ralph K. Winter, appointed by the Second Circuit by President Reagan, and first faculty advisor to the Federalist Society. He has spoken at Federalist Society events over the years, most recently in October 2020. In December, he was invited to by the Republican majority in the Senate Commerce Committee to testify, a rare sign of confidence by one party to invite a person who has publicly worked for the other party. So clearly, he has experience on working with both Democratic and Republican administrations. So let's welcome Peter, whom you can see on the screen here, to our forum, and let's get started. So Peter, I have my first question for you, and this is on the area of technology. Of course, this is Georgia Tech, and this is our strength. So let's hear from you about online platforms and the battles about what they publish or censor, or if they censor speech. Twitter blocked President Trump's account. Facebook has taken down newsgroups. What's going on here?
Hi, Kay, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. When it comes to these online platforms, I'd like to emphasize 3 things. The first one is how powerful the biggest platforms are now. The second is how the rule of law, a concept we'll come back to later, how the rule of law fits when it comes to speech on platforms. And the third is the legal reform issue, what's called Section 230 of the Communication. So going through these first, let's talk about the powerful role of the biggest platforms. And I'll describe it 2 different ways that I think are familiar to many people. From the right politically, there's potential abuse if an unaccountable tech company can censor the president. If you watch Tucker Carlson, for example, the big headline is cancel culture. Holy cow, unelected corporate executives get to block the president's main channel of communications, blocking his ability to speak to 80 million Twitter followers. So that's the cancellation, that's the powerful companies. From the left, there's a different worry about abuse. The abuse is if the president were to incite insurrection and ask for clearly illegal acts, Why should he be allowed this enormous megaphone in order to create civil disorder in violation of the law? Now, the platforms have faced this not just in the United States, but in other countries. I've done some work about how they operate in India, where there's been a problem of what they call communal violence, which is where, for instance, there might be a Hindu-led riot against Muslims at a particular time in a particular village. And Facebook and others have closed down the coordination. So the post says, go at 5 o'clock to go kill the other people, and Facebook takes that down. And to me, that makes sense. You're stopping a murder on a racial or religious basis. In the United States, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. You can't incite people to attack their fellow citizens and their government. And by the time you get to insurrection, there have to be legal consequences or consequences at a minimum on speech for the platform. So we have these powerful platforms. They have a big responsibility. What do you do about it? The second thing is I'll talk about rule of law. So listeners, I encourage you, congratulations. You just become the czar at Twitter or Facebook for when to block content. And for some things, there's been a lot of consensus. So the sites for a long time have taken down child pornography. They have technology to do that. So they take a hash of an image, and if a prohibited image shows up, they're able to block that image from being sent through their system. Okay, you're the czar now. So what rules are you going to set about these political speeches? Well, as a preliminary matter, this is not a First Amendment matter. You might think it's a legal constitutional question, but the Constitution, the First Amendment, applies to government action, not to company or individual action. And so there's a consensus among pretty much all the law professors that the companies are not doing what they call state action. So the Constitution doesn't apply. But for sure, free speech things apply. So now you're the czar, you're trying to figure out your free speech policy. Well, think about COVID for a minute. Let's say somebody's advertising fraudulent cures that are going to actually hurt people or do nothing, and they're getting rich from it. Do you think the site should be able to block these kind of fraudulent ads? The answer to that for years has been yes. TV stations and platforms block fraudulent ads. But sometimes it's not clear what's fraudulent. There might be a scientist with a new study who says COVID isn't really that bad. He blocked a scientific study. Well, probably you'll decide, no, you don't block the scientific study. Now, think about if you were the czar, what you would have done after the November election. On the night of the election, let's say somebody claimed there was evidence of irregularities and they posted some things that suggested it might be true. If you're the platform, there's a lot of reason in that moment of breaking news to say, well, we don't really know the facts here yet. So you probably let it stay up. Well, what if you've had 60 lawsuits, all of which have come out the same way and the facts seem clear on the other side? At this point, saying the election's stolen looks a lot like disinformation. It looks like it's known to be a lie. And that's what the platforms basically moved toward, was treating it like disinformation. Well, now, even if you disagree with that, let's say you have people on these platforms saying, let's storm the Capitol now and get those legislators who are stealing the election. At this point, it's looking like an incitement to riot. Today, Senator Mitch McConnell said that the mob was provoked by President Trump. You can look at the quotes. At some point, it's no longer just speech, it's incitement to take criminal action. So the rule of law question for you as the czar is, it's super difficult to make the call on each post. You've got 2 billion monthly users on Facebook. Very hard to scale that. So if the solution doesn't scale, if you don't have a good way to figure out what's good or what's bad, what do? Do we just prohibit user-generated content? Wow, that's a huge change. And so we're caught in a situation where we're not sure quite what to do. Now, legally, the way this has worked out is what's called Section 230. And the history, this is the third point. The history is the Communications Decency Act of 1996 was passed early in the internet days. It said that online platforms are not publishers. Now, when a newspaper publishes something false, you can sue them for defamation. If they say you're a serial killer, you can sue to protect your reputation. On the other hand, if a user posts a falsehood, Section 230 says Facebook can't be sued for defamation. It wasn't Facebook saying it. They just have a platform. It's the user who gets sued for defamation. So back in 1996, the idea was we're going to cut these companies a break because we want the internet companies to grow. And also, it's really expensive for a moderator to look at every post. Well, that cost problem is still true today. Now the question is, at what point maybe should the platforms be liable? So that's an introduction to some of the issues we're facing about the online.
That was comprehensive and very much a nice walk through not only the legal aspects of it, but also the technological aspects of it. And one thing that you said that was very much intriguing here, Peter, was You said, suppose you are the Czar. But before I go to my next question, I really wanted to pull that thread for a second and ask the question, who gets to be Czar? Is there an equity issue here? Is there an imbalance in terms of who gets to be Czar?
Sure.
Who gets to make that decision? And then I'll shoot you my next question.
Well, so there's a structure at Facebook where the company appointed a set of outside experts on free speech from countries around the world, men and women, people from different racial and political backgrounds. And they're sort of the appeal court right now to take on these hard questions. But there are 25 or so people who are supposed to try to help decide. There's still 2 billion users, and so the mechanism is going to be a technology that has to scale, and they're far from having figured it out.
Very interesting, and we may come back to that toward the end when we talk about the civil society and civil discourse. The next question I have for you, Peter. So we seem to be facing a choice between anything goes, which sounds bad, including disinformation, as you said earlier, incitement to riot, or censorship, which sounds bad, really bad, especially if the platforms choose one political side or another. What should we do about that?
Right. So allowing criminal conduct sounds bad. Censorship sounds bad. What do we do? Well, I've been on a law professor discussion forum since November. We've had a couple of hundred posts on what to do about Section 230. My tentative answer is more rule of law, especially by the platforms themselves. Completely being hands-off won't work. We've seen foreign disinformation campaigns, but I think the platforms have to do something in order to have a better system than we have now.
Okay. So what about the immunity suit for the platforms? This big tech?
Right. Well, there's a lot of President Trump has said, let's strip away the immunity. A lot of people have been thinking the companies have gotten too much of a free ride. Mm-hmm. I'd say that it's difficult to come up with something that a law that says when to sue and when not to sue here. I do think the company should have better procedures to address disinformation and fraud in these problems. They should take down the bots. They should have transparency about the terms of service. They have to have algorithms to try to help human judgment with some kind of appeals process. One of the problems if you strip away immunity is the large platforms, they can spend money and build these systems. But there's smaller sites with user-generated content, and they probably can't afford to check all their posts or come up with all the algorithms. So if we regulate here and say there's going to be liability, it might really hit the smaller sites extra hard. We saw a recent debate about Parler, which in some ways can be seen as another site, a small site for user-generated content and free speech. Others say it's a mechanism to coordinate illegal action. But the point is, a small site doesn't have the resources to build these systems. So it's a much harder problem. We may need to have stricter rules for the big sites and more freedom for the smaller sites. I'm not sure.
Well, that's very interesting that you say that, Peter, because it's small, big sites who has the capacity to actually manage this. But you're also using, and I think you're hinting at the term of artificial intelligence methodologies that could be used here, sure, which also have sometimes some biases built in one way or another. And so this is a ticklish problem, and I think the technologists need to get at this, but also the social scientists, and as you said, the legal as well, the legal sector as well, in terms of developing some solutions, practical solutions to what you're describing here. Sorry, go ahead.
Make one quick technology point I teach this in my cybersecurity class where we talk about disinformation. And cybersecurity is hard because as soon as you have a good defense, the attackers come up with a new trick. The problem with disinformation is as soon as the Facebooks or whoever come up with a way to block the bad stuff, the attackers come up with a new trick. And so you're in an arms race and there's not going to be some easy.
Thank you, Peter. I want to transition to the question about rule of law. Now, before preparing for this, I must say I'm an economist. I'm not a lawyer, married to a lawyer, but not a lawyer. I thought rule of law, now I know capital R, capital L, that this is a specific thing. This is something that we heard a lot about in the news recently. Just thought, if you think about it in common parlance, one wouldn't really understand what it is, but it would be really helpful if you can unpack this for us. What are the origins of the term and of the practice in terms of rule of law? How far back in history does it go? What does it establish for us? And pull that thread through to the current, what is happening today? Why
Right.
is it that we're hearing about rule of law so often today?
Well, the today point, and then I'll go into the history, is that there was an attempt by violence to undo a democratic election. And in a democracy, the most important rules of law are have fair elections and then follow the election results. And if people go to violence to undo that, that is right at the center of breaking the rule of law. That's why we're hearing so much about it today. But I think it helps. I like history and political philosophy. It helps to go back. So probably at some point, a lot of listeners have heard about the Magna Carta back in the medieval times, and that was the first document to put limits on the king. Instead of the king having unbroken power, there's limits on the king. There was a revolution in 1688 in England against the king at that point, and Parliament came in and said, no, we have to have even stronger checks and balances against the king. So that's one thing, is stop the king. But there's another part of the rule of law that people might not know as much about, which is the source of the rule of law in the religious wars between Protestants and Catholics in Europe. After the Reformation started, there were centuries really of brutal slaughter. And you know this in American history. When Queen Elizabeth I was a Protestant and then it switched to a Catholic king in England, the Pilgrims left England because they thought they wouldn't be able to practice their religion anymore. They ended up eventually coming over to Massachusetts. Later on, when the Protestants came back into power, a bunch of Catholics left England to come to Maryland, which was a colony, to have Catholics have religious freedom. And think about what was at stake here. Not just the history of people getting killed, but in some countries in Europe during this time, if you prayed to the wrong religion, if you had a Protestant service in a Catholic country like France, you were subject to the death penalty. On the other hand, if you didn't do your religion, you might be damned to hell, literally, for eternity. You were going to be undoing what you were required to do by your religious faith. So being caught between a death penalty and eternal damnation, that's how serious the religious problems were. And so a foundational part of our government was, how do we allow free exercise of religion with all these different people, but also not have the state establish religion so that it's crushing down on people's different religious beliefs. So rule of law is allowing religion, but not having dictatorship by religion. And that's been a really central part of the history of rule of law and why people care about it so much.
So how does that end up, or how is it built in to our U.S. Constitution? Because we've heard, all of a sudden we're, pulling out the Constitution and trying to understand it today. How does that rule of law, how is that built into our Constitution?
Well, it's built in through what I hope a lot of listeners heard of separation of powers or checks and balances, but it's putting limits on the king, as it were. So the Congress can Congress can pass a law, and the president can stop Congress. He can veto it. But if the president vetoes it, Congress, if it has a really big majority, can override the veto. So there's room for Congress and the president. They have to have discourse with each other. Impeachment's another thing. The president has tons of power to do things. But if the president goes and does a high crime or misdemeanor, then Congress can act and remove the president. So each one is subject to checks and balances from the other. That's built into the Constitution in this most fundamental way.
Well, if you look at the rule of law and power, the peaceful transformation of power, which we're looking at, trucks are backing up to the White House, trucks are both coming and going, and we're thinking that we're used to this peaceful transition of power, and right now it's not quite looking that way. If you look at the video feeds from not only Washington, D.C., but other main cities throughout the United States. So can you, again, pull that thread through of the rule of law to this, what we expect to be a peaceful transition of power?
Right. Remember, I said the core thing for rule of law is to have a fair election and then to follow the election result. But this idea that there's a transition to someone new instead of a violent overthrow goes back to George Washington. He ran for president, won, and overwhelmingly ran again, won again. And people encouraged him to be king, to be a lifetime ruler because he was so respected. He had won the Revolutionary War. But George Washington instead stepped down voluntarily. He returned to the country estate and gave time to someone else to do it, handed it over to John Adams. John Adams was the second president, and he had a big political fight with Thomas Jefferson, the other political party. And that was a little more complicated. John Adams and his people tried to have some judges snuck in at the last moment who would basically undermine the election results by being judges. And there was a Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison, maybe the most famous Supreme Court case for many years. And the court in that case did two things. One is they found a way not to let Adams screw up the next administration. But the second thing is the court announced that the judicial review, that the Supreme Court announces a rule of law. It's not about the man, it's not about the party, but the rule of law is going to apply, and the judges are there to enforce it. And we've had that tradition since then, since the first two transitions of peaceful transfer of power. It didn't work that well in 1860 with Abraham Lincoln. There was a mess in 1876, but except for those, it's been straightforward. The winner of the election wins. When Al Gore lost by a few hundred votes in Florida after a big dispute, he got up and he was very graceful. He was very much saying, okay, Mr. Bush has won. He will be the president. Support him. That's been true in every other election until this year. And this year, for weeks and weeks after the election, President Trump refused to say that he was committed to a peaceful transition of power. He continued to say things that weren't true about the election, that he knew by then were not true. And it's led to this sense of violence that we've seen and potential violence again, and the huge military presence on the National Mall today, the day before the inauguration. So that's why it's such a disruption. If you look at the history, what's happened in the last week since November's election is outside by miles what we've ever seen before in American history, except for the periods around the Civil War. It's really an aberration in American history. It's part of why Senator McConnell today and many others have said this is serious and needs to be addressed in a different way.
Is it broken, Peter? I'm curious about your thoughts there. Is it broken or is it just an aberration?
I believe President Biden, President-elect today, President Tamara Biden, is committed to the rule of law. I worked with him in the White House and have respect for him and his integrity to follow the law. But we see really surprising polls where the support for democracy in the United States is the lowest it's been in recorded memory since the polls were taken. And in the latest campaign, there were people, advertisements from the right saying this is all about socialism and saying we're going to lead right to Cuba and Castro and Venezuela. And on the left, there were big concerns about Trump being friends with right-wing authoritarians like in Russia. So each side feels like the other side is tilting over into dangerous, super dangerous ground of possible tyrannical authority. So that could happen. And our job, I think, is to bring us back from the brink, try to find bridges, hold people accountable where there's criminal cases that can be proven, but to move back from the brink and to lower the temperature. And I hope that will happen.
And I hope that also with you, Peter, that happens across the aisle as we get our government started again under a new administration, but expecting both sides, if you will, to contribute to this mending. The last section that we're going to talk about actually goes to that point about sides, the importance of listening to the other side. And truly listening, the Civic Square. In the popular vote this year, Mr. Biden received over 81 million votes, the largest number in history. Mr. Trump received more than 74 million votes, the second largest number in history. For lots of people, there's a huge question. How could so many people have voted for the other candidate? What would you have us consider about the huge vote totals on the one hand, first of all, for both candidates, and what does it mean in terms of continuing in our society in hopefully a civic square?
Well, thank you. So the huge turnout shows one thing clearly. A historically large fraction of Americans felt there was a lot riding on this election. Millions of votes came from people who usually don't vote. And so I think what I'd like to do is take a minute and invite people from each side of this divide to imagine why people might have voted the other way, as strange and weird and unimaginable as that might seem to you. And so I'm going to first, and I've worked this through with someone who I know very well and admire who voted for for President Trump. Here's some concerns on the political right that I think a lot of people on the left have had a hard time hearing. There's people on the left, I've certainly heard it and seen it, who can't imagine how any sane person would have voted for Trump, which means then that 74 million people are insane under the quite true. So here's some things that I think are points worth listening to for politically left people that maybe don't deeply, maybe you haven't listened to as hard as you could. The first one is this problem of possible censorship of communications. If the president can be shut down by companies, how do we stop the kind of power from the platforms and the media and potentially from government when it might turn out that one side gets its voice heard, but there's lots of new limits on the other side getting its voice heard? If the platforms were to become politically leaning one way or the other, and legally they actually can under current law, that would be something to worry about. A second thing is religion, and I told you the history of religion as part of the hardest reason we have to work together. And here's a thing from religion that happened under President Obama when I was working in government. When people were building Obamacare, there was a rule that here's the list of medical things that everybody has to pay for in health. And that list included contraception, and there was proposal that it would include abortion as well. Well, I believe strongly that people should have good medical care, and I favor having medical care for both of these things. But imagine for a minute that you were a Catholic, that you were a nun, and you were told to work in your profession that you had to pay for contraception and abortion. Well, that feels like, and that was the actual case that went to the Supreme Court, that feels like your religious views are being undermined by people who don't care about your religious views, having to pay for something that's against your views. This came up in the pandemic also. So as some places were closed down and some places were opened up, there were cities where restaurants were allowed to open, but churches and other religious places weren't yet. And if religion is that central to many people's beliefs and identities, part of why people came to the United States, the Pilgrims and others, then having that religion come less important than opening a restaurant just seems to be a blind spot about the importance of sincere religious faith to people that maybe folks who aren't religious haven't thoroughly considered. A third thing from the right so the first one was the possibility of censorship. The second one is religion being honored in a fair way. A third one is a sense that the elites of America have lined up, a lot of them on one side, the political elites, the media, Hollywood, Silicon Valley. And if you don't think things are being run right in this country, and you don't like the way things are organized, you have a general sense that things aren't quite right, you might not like those elites. You might want somebody who's going to kick at those elites, try to undo them, try to come up with different ways to run things. And so feeling like the system is against you is a dangerous way to feel if you're trying to be part of a country. A fourth thing that I'd say on the conservative side of the spectrum is that there's views about there was violence last summer in Portland and Michigan. Now, there's really sharp factual disagreements about this. I actually think that a lot of last summer was peaceful protests, and there's been a lot of misinformation about it. But whatever the facts turn out to be, many people saw images of Portland on fire, people throwing things at the federal building, and took that as a representation of the kind of violence the country was facing. And then if they see suddenly, in their view, people on the political left getting upset about violence here, but allowing that or not condemning it, there's a concern of hypocrisy. The last one, and this is tricky, and I'm going to try to say it carefully, another thing that I think people on the political right in some instances felt is this fear of socialism or communism, which has long been a theme in American politics. Now, in my view, my informed view, President Biden's not a socialist, but Bernie Sanders ran on the Socialist Party ticket. And it looked for a while like Bernie Sanders might be the nominee for the Democratic Party. So if you're looking at that from the outside and you say Bernie Sanders represents a great big chunk of the Democratic Party, it's actually, there's a reason to wonder about socialism. And we've seen in the past socialist countries turn into Cuba, Venezuela, things that were really bad. So I don't think Biden's a socialist. I know he's not. But there are socialists proudly speaking within the Democratic Party, and people who are scared of that have a reason to be scared. So I don't know if I've done a justice to people on the political right, but I've tried to voice some reasons why people might have voted that way. Now I'll just do a quick version on the political left. It was a violent attack on the government. Okay, we've already talked about this. It was an armed attack. We've had a lot more evidence come out since January 6th of how serious the attack was. Vice President Pence got out of the Senate chamber literally about a minute before attackers got in there. And so that's a big one. That's off the charts, as I said. A second one is when you compare the Lafayette Square peace vigil during the summer and the tear gas and force the president used to clear it, that's just such a different way than the police handled the almost entirely white protesters at the Capitol. Trump, when it was Portland, President Trump said everyone should get 10 years in jail if they harm a federal building. But when they attacked the Capitol, he said he loved the people, that was his quote, who did the damage to the Capitol. And so the sort of unfair treatment of protests from the two political sides is very great. A third thing on the political spectrum from the left that the right has trouble hearing is we're at a university, we take the search for truth seriously. And President Trump had the birther conspiracy. He said that Obama wasn't president. He said President Obama tapped his phones, which he didn't do. He said the U.S. murder rate would have historic highs when in fact murder rate is way down from 1990. In so many places, the factual claims didn't hold up to scrutiny. And that's what we saw again with the 2020 election. The Republican officials in Georgia clearly showed that there was a super careful vote. They checked 15,000 votes in Cobb County. There wasn't a single signature mismatch. And now there's proposals in Georgia to get rid of absentee ballots because they think there's fraud in signatures. So, the facts don't support that. The other thing from the political left, or the political center, or political right in this case, is a fear of fascism. Just as I said, there's a basis for conservatives worrying about socialism, there's a basis for Americans to fear the fascist aspects of what we've seen. And so the historical formula for fascism starts by getting rid of the shared truth, and then the charismatic leader gets to make up the truth, and that gets accepted by the willing followers. That's if you go back to Mussolini, if you go back to other fascists, Franco, others, this is what we've seen. And there's a big lie. The big lie could be that this racial group is inferior, or that the election was stolen. But with that lie, and with the faithful believing in it, we've seen how the conservative side of the political spectrum can slip into fascist kind of actions in Russia and Turkey and Hungary as three recent examples. So there's serious concerns on both sides, Kaye. I do think that just taking the time and effort to imagine yourself having those other views can calm down some of the anger and give us some chance to speak to better in the Civic Square.
That was exceptional, Peter. Thank you so much, because sometimes these are words that are hard to say, hard to even ponder. And some of the words, even, depending on your news feed, you never really come across, or you have an alternate view of what it even means. So I really do appreciate your laying that out from both sides. But now I have to ask this question. Are you trying to say that the arguments on each side have the same, are as good as the other? Are you slipping into the mistake of whataboutism? Yes, there was an attack on the Capitol by the right, but there was also violence in Portland by the left. We're even.
Right.
I mean, is that where we're going?
Right. So, look, I have my views about what the facts are. I've studied this a lot. I have views about what's right and wrong. But I wasn't asked to do this video today, from Georgia Tech to give my political views. I've tried to show openness to different perspectives of people. I'm trying to make a different point. It's that people of good faith, family members, friends, neighbors, people you work with, some of them voted for different candidates this year. A lot of people voted for both sides. And it's a mistake, in my view, to think that everybody on the other side, and other is a scary word here because then they're not like you, but everyone on the other side was a racist or a socialist or something else. You don't learn from the labels. So my point instead is to listen and to try to understand how a person of good faith could reach the opposite conclusion. As a lawyer, we're trained to understand the other side's best arguments because that's going to let you make your case better. And as a human being, you want to listen to the opposite point of view, partly to show respect to human beings, and partly to get out of your self-righteousness and come to some humility that in some aspects you can learn. But most importantly, as a nation, I think we have our best chance to reaffirm democracy, to reaffirm the rule of law, if we can genuinely try to understand the best arguments of people of good faith, even when they're on the other side. So we can head to wrap up, but that's what I'm trying to do is promote listening and learning, which is something a university is designed to do.
So at this technological university, as we started off by saying, and we kind of talked about the technology side, but also we have humanists, we have social scientists, we have a number of different perspectives in terms of political perspectives as well. We're talking about two, but there's several. It's not just only Democrat and Republican, right? And of course, so with all of that in the mix, do you have any final points to make about our civic square here at Georgia Tech and within our general society?
I'll make 4 points, but make them briefly. The first is the universities in this country and elsewhere come out of the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Education, facts, scientific inquiry, and that should be central to what our university does and what we try to teach our students. A second is there needs to be fact-based accountability. When people break the laws, then they should be facing consequences. And we can have trials and we have systems of law and judges to do that. The third that I've emphasized is respect for political views. They may be politically different from you or political opponents, but they're not your enemy. I hope that that continues to be a feature of the American way of doing our lives. And the last one is I want to read 2 quotes from Abraham Lincoln from his 2 most famous speeches. These are things that I had to memorize when I was in high school years ago. But I'd like to first do the Gettysburg Address, just a sentence or 2, and then the last inaugural. So in the Gettysburg Address, and remember, Abraham Lincoln had more experience than any other president in history in civic discord. I mean, boy, did he, the Civil War. And he said at Gettysburg that his hopes that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And he said in the famous words, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That's the creed of democracy, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, for all the people, not just for the blue or the red voters. The second part, the closing part from his second inaugural address, which he gave just a few months before he was assassinated, was this. And this was a line I also had to memorize back in high school. With malice towards none, that's hard to have, with malice towards none, with charity for all,
wow,
with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. I bet Joe Biden will say something like that tomorrow in the inauguration. To care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, honor the people who've struggled so hard to defend our country. And then he says, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves, and he added, and with all nations. I think that's a civic creed that we can go back to today, government of and by and for the people, and how to cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves with malice towards none and charity towards all. Those are a lot to aspire to. I hope we can do it.
Thank you so very much, Peter. We've just been talking with Peter Swire, the Elizabeth and Tommy Holder Chair of Law and Ethics at the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business. I'm Kaye Husbands Fealing, Dean of Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts. Thank you very much.